All right, I just want to thank Professor Zunes for making time to talk with us today. I'm going to go ahead and go right into the first question that I have for you.
Mhm.
So the Resource Center for Nonviolence is deeply influenced by Martin Luther King Jr.'s philosophy of nonviolence and the concept of the beloved community. How does your approach to understanding and resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict resonate with these principles of nonviolence and justice?
Well, it's really at the core that we have two peoples with historic claims to the same land that are needing to figure out a way they can share it, and either as a viable two-state solution with a Palestinian state alongside Israel, or some kind of binational state, one single binational state with equal rights for all peoples. And there are other suggestions as well, but it's rooted in the principle of the equality. And the problem we've had is that that for decades we've seen these competing claims uh, uh, promoted through the use of violence, which has been, not only obviously the moral concerns. I mean, the horror of the October 7th Hamas terrorist attack, and the horror of the carpet bombing of crowded civilian neighborhoods in Gaza. I mean, there's obviously the moral travesty of this, and other acts of terrorism, other acts of terror bombing, dispossession or repression, that we've seen to the Israeli occupation and the like, and in reaction to it. In addition to the moral aspects, is that politically it has not moved things forward. In fact, it has made things worse. It has embittered both sides. And I've always liked about Rcnv is they not only appreciate the moral underpinnings of nonviolence, but like Martin Luther King, they also recognize that strategically, tactically, it is far more effective means of advancing struggle, of advancing the political goals that one has. And so I think having a multi-issue peace group um, addressing Palestine and Israel is particularly important. Too long, Israel and Palestine has been the province of groups that were more ideologically focused, or people with certain ethnic or religious ties to the region. And many of the more mainstream peace groups have kind of avoided it, even as they addressed other international crises around the world. But Rcnv has actually taken leadership going way back to the 1970s, long before any other peace group, it seemed, were picking up the issue, and has taken real leadership in educating the public and organizing people around the conflict and the U.S. role.
Can I, so you everything that you just said made me realize, and sort of bringing up something that I've observed. It seems a really critical time for us in the United States to come together around this issue, especially if we really want to see not only progress in the Middle East, but progress in our own country. So I know historically we've had allyship across all communities in this country, including the Jewish community, and Jewish identified people have been at the head of lots of our legislation, policy making, movement making. So can you speak a little bit to that? Because I really am troubled and personally feeling reactions to pushing back on this conflict and having and really witnessing a sort of tearing apart of communities.
Yes, it's very sad to see in a lot of ways, especially when you have members of the Jewish community who, as you noted, have been often in the forefront of struggles for peace and social justice in our society and indeed around the world. And through Rcnv's work over the years, area Jews have played a disproportionate role in the leadership and in the activism and in the initiatives. But unfortunately, there are even progressive members of the Jewish community who do feel a certain attachment with Israel as the world's only Jewish state. And in reaction to the horrors of October 7th and other threats against Israel over the years, can become rather defensive and will often deny or rationalize for war crimes committed by Israel. I mean, in certain ways, it reminds me of certain people in the far left, who so much want to believe in these socialist revolutions in the global South that they will and will assume that all criticisms against them are based on imperialist machinations that they will deny or rationalize for human rights abuses or whatever. And because the ideological alignment is so strong. Again, that's understandable because a lot of attacks against socialist governments really are unfounded and hypocritical and whatever. And just like many attacks against Israel, really are motivated by anti-Semitism and double standards. But but at least in Rcnv circles, and most peace and human rights circles, the criticisms of Israel have been quite valid and quite reasonable and quite consistent with the work that we have done regarding Iraq, regarding Central America, regarding apartheid South Africa, all the many struggles that those of us in the peace and human rights community have been involved in over the decades. And we're not singling out Israel. We're not treating Israel differently than any other country that engages in invasions, occupation, war crimes, and the like. So I think it's important that when we address these issues, we look at these underlying values like human rights and international law, like enlightened self-interest, to not get bogged down in ideological arguments about the nature of Zionism or whatever, but look at the basics, the basic principles of nonviolence and human rights and justice, that has undergirded all these other struggles we've been involved in over the years.
So I just want to thank you. I just want to make a brief statement that I don't know that we'll be able to dig deep into it, but I do want to provide this framework because I think it's really important right now. So when I look at the dynamics that are occurring amongst many of us, as we witness this horrifying, just the tragedy of having to sit back and witness what is going on, the killing and the incredible suffering. I'm having a hard time, and I know many of us are having a hard time making sense of what it is that we're witnessing. And so as you're speaking and you're explaining and you're articulating what it is that we're probably struggling with in the historical context of it, I'm also reminded that even in the work that we're doing here in the United States and in the work that we're trying to expand on within the center, there has been and needed to really refocus how some of these human experiences have created a tremendous amount of trauma. Mm-hmm. And that we haven't paid sufficient attention to what it does to the human individual, to the person, to have to witness violence against another person. Mm-hmm. And as a person of color myself, and as a person that has been involved in social justice and anti-violent understandings my whole life, I'm very much aware of the trauma that comes with being a vilified individual. So I just wanted to say those two things to add another way of filtering some of this information. And even in the moment, even as we're talking about it, even in this moment, as I am speaking to you about it, it weighs very heavy and it is difficult to digest. So just another, I just wanted to add that as another point of awareness and another call to action that can be more personal, which is for everyone to pay attention to the personal impact and to care for oneself around these issues, and to be kind to yourself and to be kind to other people.
It's very important. I'm glad you, so glad that you raised that. I mean, it is traumatic to see so much suffering. It's traumatic to realize that our government, our tax dollars, are being used to kill so many thousands of children and other innocent civilians. And it's hard to see that our government is virtually alone in the world in blocking the United Nations from taking action to ease the suffering. So the personal responsibilities that we feel, as with Iraq and Vietnam, Central America, other wars the United States is directly or indirectly been involved in is very hard. And it's also, I'm sure, it's particularly triggering for people of color because the United States, of course, is speaking out, as it should, against Russia's terror bombing of apartment blocks and civilian areas in Ukraine, and yet we support it when it's done to people of color. I don't think there's any question that the whiteness of the Ukrainians and the fact that the mass majority of them are Christians gives the gives them, our government more sympathy to their plight than those of the predominantly Muslim, Arab Palestinians. So it underscores the inherent racism we see in much of our U.S. policy. I think it's also, important to recognize the trauma of many Jews, even those who oppose Netanyahu, even those who oppose the government, with the horror of the attacks on October 7th, the fact that these were innocent civilians, the fact that there were sexual crimes, the fact that it's the largest killing of Jews since the Holocaust. And also, one of the tragic ironies is that the primary targets of these attacks were these kibbutzim along the border of Gaza. Kibbutzim were these socialist collectives of progressive Israelis, many of whom are active in the anti-occupation struggle. I know people in those kibbutzim who've been arrested and beaten in nonviolent civil disobedience against Israel's trying to tear down these Palestinian Bedouin villages in the Negev and in the West Bank. And these people were victims of these attacks. And similarly, the concert goers, people who go to raves don't tend to be right wing on average. So again, these were and so this killing is obviously very difficult for many Jews. Again, even those who very much oppose Netanyahu, oppose the occupation, and the like. And it's also triggering, I think, that while claims of anti-Semitism on elements of the pro-Palestinian movement have been grossly exaggerated. I mean, certainly weaponized in many ways in McCarthyistic fashion. The fact is there are anti-Semites in the mix, and we got to really recognize that. But we shouldn't have a crying wolf phenomenon that we're so defensive against the false charges that we miss the concerns that are really genuine. And even slogans that in and of themselves are not violent. I mean, intifada simply means shaking off. It doesn't imply violence. River to the sea for most people is in terms of a democratic binational state for all people. And yet a lot of Jews have been convinced that these slogans, these terms are about genocide against the Jews. And these are false, and the misinterpretation of these slogans has been deliberately to stifle debate. We nevertheless should probably be sensitive how people might interpret these, even if there is no violent intention in saying them.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to acknowledge that we're in January now. And for us as a center, we celebrate Martin Luther King Day. And so we are active in participating in the march locally. We have MLK Youth Day coming up. And one of the things that really hits home for me during this season is his speech Beyond Vietnam.
Mhm.
I was reading it a day or two ago, just to reflect on, some of the things that he said back in the 1960s. I think it was that he wrote this speech.
Mhm.
It was like a year
April
before
4th, 1967.
Thank you. And there was something very striking in that speech that I keyed in on, which was that Martin Luther King was critical of the Vietnam War for many reasons, but one of the things that he mentioned that I thought might be relevant to us today is that the Vietnam War was really effective in deflecting from the civil rights movement in the United States.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about that as it relates to this current conflict in Israel-Palestine.
Well, what was remarkable about King's speech, which was exactly 1 year before his assassination, was not just that it was politically risky. I mean, President Johnson was furious that he was going against his Vietnam policy after getting a lot of support from the administration for civil rights legislation and the like. Funding for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference plummeted because there are certain liberals who are happy about him standing up against these anachronistic segregation laws in the South. But when you start to challenge U.S. foreign policy, that was seen as unreasonable. But I think the power is that he made the connection between racism at home and inequality at home with the military-industrial complex and with U.S. imperialism, and that we really cannot separate them. We really cannot achieve justice here at home while pursuing militaristic and imperialist and racist policies abroad. And we're at a very interesting point right here. We have President Biden, who has been surprisingly good on a lot of domestic issues. I mean, he's in terms of domestic policy, he is the most progressive president since Lyndon Johnson, in terms of trying to use the government in ways to better the lives of the poor and middle class, and to invest in our infrastructure and do all these good things, while at the same time, he is pursuing a foreign policy which is killing thousands of children, innocent people, as it made the United States isolated in the world, by supporting a criminal war. And just as back then, you have a lot of liberals who are really defensive about Biden and don't criticize Biden, and because it will only help the Republicans. And among the labels I'm called, for speaking out against Biden's policy in Israel-Palestine, besides supposedly being an anti-Semite and pro-terrorist and that nonsense, people say, "Oh, you must be pro-Trump," because criticizing Biden is helping Trump. But we can't be silent. We can't be silent. I mean, obviously, Trump, the return of Trump is a very real threat. But we need to appreciate Biden where he's done good things, but we have to really hit home that it's totally unacceptable for the United States to be aiding and abetting what meets the legal international definition of genocide in terms of the indiscriminate nature of the bombing against the civilian population. And not to mention the U.S. policies, which Biden has supported throughout his political career, going back to the 70s, which have denied the Palestinians the right of self-determination, denied them a viable state of their own, which has directly led to the rise of Hamas. Hamas these reactionary Islamist currents were not a factor in Palestinian politics until just the past few decades, when U.S. policy, made it impossible for the moderate Palestinians to gain the victories they had to enhance their legitimacy and bring peace to the region.
Wonderful. Thank you for that clarity. I'm just curious if we can close up with what you want those attending your upcoming talk here at the center on January 11th, what you want people to take away from what you will share.
Well, I think the key thing is a critically important role of the United States in the conflict. For decades, the United States has had the contradictory role of insisting on being the chief mediator, indeed the sole mediator of the conflict, as we've consistently pushed the United Nations out of the way, vetoed resolutions saying the UN shouldn't be involved, that the United States, the U.S. alone, is in charge of the peace process. To say that we're the sole mediator of the conflict, but we're also the primary military, financial, and diplomatic supporter of one of the two parties, the more powerful of the two parties by far. And no one who's ever studied conflict resolution could tell you that no agreement has ever happened, no sustainable agreement has ever taken place when the mediator is also the biggest supporter of the more powerful of the parties involved. And so that is why there's no peace. It's not about religion. It's not that they inherently hate each other. It's not that we couldn't create a situation where there are equal rights for both peoples and effectively resolve the conflict, either through a viable Palestinian state alongside Israel or a binational state with guaranteed equal rights for both. And so I think the important thing is a critical need to change U.S. policy. And but I would also emphasize is that popular movements have changed U.S. policy before on Iraq, on Central America, on South Africa, on Vietnam, on East Timor, on the nuclear arms race. We've seen repeatedly where grassroots movements have made a difference. And I think we've really, for the first time, reached something of a critical mass, that this is now a really big movement that is involving a wide variety of progressive activists. And even though we are actually in many ways dealing with some of the worst repression we've seen, I mean, in terms of people losing their jobs, of student groups being banned, of speakers being in film showings, being canceled by big pressure. I mean, this is extraordinary. I haven't seen this in a good 60 years in this country. I mean, even in the Reagan era. You never saw people, Central America solidarity groups or South Africa solidarity groups being banned by college administrations. What you're seeing is happening to Palestine solidarity groups, including even Jewish-led groups that are challenging this. So we are looking at a lot of very real repression right now, and I think it's all very, very important to fight back because, and this is one thing I really am going to emphasize as well, and that is that if Biden and the powers that be can think they can get away with the United States supporting a war that 68% of Americans believe should end, 80%, 85% of Democrats think should end, that all the mainline churches think should end, all the peace and human rights groups should end, it's such virtually all the world's governments believe should end. If Biden thinks that by siding with Netanyahu, siding with the Christian fundamentalists, siding with the right-wing Republicans, if he thinks he can do that and get away with it, what else might he do in a second term or some other president do? War with Iran, war with Venezuela? We can think of all sorts of scenarios. So it's really, really critical, given that the majority of people are on the side of those of us looking for peace and human rights. The majority of Americans want the United States to stop unconditional military aid to Israel. They want the United States to stop opposing a ceasefire. They want the United States to apply at least tough love on Israel to pressure it to make the necessary compromises for peace. We are in the majority. And if the majority cannot prevail on this issue, especially in light of all the suffering that people are seeing every day online of the civilians being killed and that kind of thing, if we can't stop this, they may think they can get away with even worse things in the future. So a victory for the forces of peace and human rights, the international law, is important, not just for the Palestinians, but I think it could be a benchmark for struggles we'll be seeing in international affairs in the coming decades.
Thank you. Well, thank you for your wonderful interview. We're looking forward to seeing you on the 11th.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it.